Can y'all share thoughts based on interviews or conversations on the implications for the Black and Latino or Latina families and students who are left behind when folks either decide to move out or their communities for better schools or use vouchers?
That's an interesting framing. And Olga, I'll tell you why it's interesting, because I haven't encountered folks kind of seeing themselves as left behind. Oftentimes, folks who don't opt to move, who aren't given the option, it's kind of business as usual, right? This is the neighborhood that I grew up in, that my mama grew up in. So, like, this is what I expect. So, I haven't experienced a lot of like disappointment or regret around folks who have been left behind. That's not to say that there may not be those spaces or some antagonisms that exist. But oftentimes, it's literally folks who are still very committed, like, hey, how do I make this place where I live better? I want to be able to go to work and have my kids go to school and come home and then be safe at school, safe walking home, and for us to be able to have dinner together. It's the same fundamental desires that I think often motivate folks who do get the option to move, right? We're motivated around community, we're motivated around security. Not in the sense like we need like surveillance and those things, but the idea of like, if I could relax and not have to juggle so many things, that would be amazing. Because oftentimes the folks that are left behind are remaining in segregated neighborhoods that are not just segregated by house, but they're distant from jobs, they're disconnected from quality public transportation, or there's a high cost of commute, and these are things that keep you from living your life in a fuller and a better way, I would argue.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I actually also, I've never encountered a Black or brown person who felt that they had been left behind, right, by family members making the decision to or community members making the decision to move to a different community. What I will say, similar to what we just heard from Professor Lewis-McCoy, is that there is typically, I think, a continuing life, right, as normal, but also still a commitment and a desire to making sure that the neighborhood receives the investment, right, that it should. And so, again, I think here, what I typically find from people who are dealing with, the loss of community members to other neighborhoods that are more well resourced, is just, again, the understanding that the lack of equity, right, is the issue here. Gosh, I mean, when I have these conversations with Black folks in New Orleans, for instance, they don't begrudge anybody who has made the decision to move to a different community, but they are still going to continue to work to demand resources within their own community. So that's the framing that I've experienced versus the left behind framing. And I did want to just say, just kind of popped into my head that I should mention with regard to single family and multifamily housing. So kind of just quickly back to that, is that if folks aren't aware, generally speaking, zoning rules have to allow for the building of multifamily housing. Now, there's a bunch of zoning regulations I'm not going to get into, but just in case folks don't have this foundational kind of knowledge for the conversation, there are certain kinds of buildings that can be built in certain communities based on how the community is zoned. So there are a couple of cities across the country that don't have any zoning laws. I think Houston is a city famously where there's no zoning, but Houston is still incredibly segregated. That's a topic for another day. But typically speaking, a community might be zoned for residential development or commercial development. And in communities where residential development is allowed, right, so housing can be built in that community, there's generally never any permission that's needed to you don't generally have to get any permission to build single family housing, right? Like, any residentially zoned community will accept the building of like a single family house. But in many communities across the country, there are limits to where multifamily housing, right, apartment complexes can be built. And so my point in talking about multifamily housing is that in many communities, particularly where there are wealthy folks or folks who have a lot of resources and the communities are well resourced, if those communities allow any multifamily housing at all, they will very often allow it in a particular area, right? And then all of the students from that area where multifamily housing is allowed are being zoned into a specific set of schools. And so I just wanted to close that loop there in case it wasn't very clear earlier.